Before Rome became the eternal city, before its legions conquered the Mediterranean, before its emperors reshaped the known world, another civilization flourished across the Italian peninsula. The Etruscans built cities of remarkable sophistication in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, establishing a confederation of 12 major city-states that would dominate the region for centuries. They were architects, engineers, artists, and philosophers, whose influence would ripple through history in ways Rome would eventually claim as its own. From the 6th century through 509 before the Common Era, Etruscan kings actually ruled Rome itself. The Tarquinian dynasty brought with them innovations that would become the foundation of Roman civilization, architectural techniques, religious practices, and social structures that the Romans would absorb and eventually forget to acknowledge. Yet the Etruscans left no written historical records of their own perspective. Their language remains largely undeciphered, their voices silent across the centuries. What we know comes from fragments, the tombs they carved into hillsides, the bronze sculptures and painted pottery they created, the inscriptions they left behind in a script we can read but barely understand. In 396 before the Common Era, Rome conquered Veii, a major Etruscan city, and the balance of power shifted forever. The civilization that had taught Rome everything would gradually disappear, absorbed and erased from memory. Yet their fingerprints remain everywhere, waiting to be discovered in the ruins of a world they built. In the fertile valleys and rolling hills of central Italy, long before the marble temples and military camps of Rome would dominate the landscape, a civilization flourished with remarkable sophistication and cultural depth. The Etruscans, whose name echoes through history with a sense of mystery and allure, emerged from the very soil of the Italian peninsula itself. Modern archaeological evidence has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of their origins, revealing a people whose roots ran deep into the indigenous populations of the region, not as foreign invaders arriving from distant shores, but as descendants of the Villanovan culture that had inhabited these lands for generations. The transformation from Villanovan communities into what we recognize as Etruscan civilization occurred gradually during the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. This was not a sudden revolution, but rather an evolution marked by increasing complexity, expanding trade networks, and the development of increasingly sophisticated urban centers. Archaeological excavations across central Italy have uncovered the material evidence of this transformation layer by layer, revealing how communities grew in size, wealth, and cultural ambition. The DNA analysis conducted in 2021 provided definitive confirmation of what many scholars had come to suspect. The Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, their ancestry intertwined with the peninsula itself. The heartland of Etruscan civilization stretched across what is now Tuscany and parts of Umbria, a region blessed with natural resources and geographic advantages. Fertile agricultural lands provided the foundation for population growth, while access to metal deposits, particularly iron and copper, gave the Etruscans economic leverage in the expanding Mediterranean trade networks. The Tyrrhenian Sea, which borders this region, became their highway to commerce and cultural exchange. This geographical positioning proved crucial to their rise as a major Mediterranean trading power, connecting them to Greek colonies to the south, to the Phoenicians across the sea, and to the emerging communities of the Italian peninsula itself. By the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, a confederation of city-states had crystallized across Etruria. The Etruscan League, a loose but meaningful alliance of 12 major cities, represented both the unity and the independence that characterized Etruscan political organization. These were not cities subordinate to a single ruler, but rather autonomous urban centers that recognized shared cultural identity and common interests. Each city maintained its own government, its own religious practices, and its own distinctive character, yet all participated in a broader Etruscan identity. This federal structure would prove both a source of strength and ultimately a vulnerability when faced with the rising power of Rome. The cities themselves were marvels of urban planning and architectural innovation. Veii, located at coordinates 42 degrees, 1 minute, 16 seconds north, and 12 degrees, 23 minutes, 27 seconds east, emerged as one of the largest and most influential Etruscan cities. Its position near the Tiber River made it a natural center of power and commerce. Cerveteri, situated at 42 degrees, 0 minutes, 24 seconds north, and 12 degrees, 6 minutes, 7 seconds east, became famous throughout the Mediterranean world for its wealth and cultural refinement. Vulci, at 42 degrees, 25 minutes, 10 seconds north, and 11 degrees, 37 minutes, 49 seconds east, developed into a major port city with extensive trade connections. These cities and others like them featured sophisticated drainage systems, planned street layouts, and public spaces that rivaled anything in the Greek world. The architecture of these cities reflected both practical ingenuity and aesthetic sensibility. The Etruscans developed advanced engineering techniques, constructing buildings that would influence Roman architecture for centuries to come. Temple design, in particular, showed distinctive Etruscan characteristics that would later be absorbed and modified by Roman builders. The Portonaccio Temple at Veii, excavated during the 20th century, stands as a testament to their architectural ambitions. Its terracotta statues, including the famous Apollo of Veii from the 6th century before the Common Era, demonstrate a mastery of sculptural form and an understanding of how art could enhance sacred spaces. Religious practice permeated Etruscan life, and the archaeological record preserves vivid evidence of their spiritual world. The examination of animal livers, a practice known as haruspicy, formed a central component of Etruscan divination and religious observance. Priests trained extensively in interpreting the patterns and markings found within sacrificial animals, seeking to understand divine will and predict future events. This religious system would profoundly influence Roman practice, as the Romans adopted and adapted Etruscan methods of reading the divine intention. The very term haruspex, the Etruscan priest who performed these rituals, would become embedded in Roman religious vocabulary and practice. The tombs of the Etruscans offer perhaps our most intimate glimpse into their daily lives and cultural values. The Banditacha necropolis at Cerveteri preserves hundreds of tombs carved into the living rock, arranged in orderly streets that mirror the layout of the living city above. These were not simple graves, but elaborate chambers designed to house the dead in comfort, filled with furnishings, vessels, hors d'oeuvres, and objects that the deceased might require in the afterlife. The Regolini Galassi tomb, discovered in 1836 at Cerveteri, yielded spectacular treasures that astonished the archaeological world: exquisite gold jewelry, bronze vessels of remarkable craftsmanship, and imported Greek pottery that testified to far-ranging trade connections. These artifacts, now preserved in museums throughout Europe, speak of a people who valued beauty, craftsmanship, and material refinement. The vibrant wall paintings that adorned Etruscan tombs provide windows into their social world. The Tomb of the Leopards at Tarquinia, dating to the 5th century before the Common Era, displays scenes of banqueting and dancing rendered in bold, expressive brushwork. Musicians play their instruments, dancers move with fluid grace, and diners recline at their tables in attitudes of leisure and celebration. These paintings capture moments of joy and community, suggesting a culture that found meaning in artistic expression, social gathering, and the pleasures of civilized life. The fact that women appear prominently in these scenes, sharing meals with men and participating in public celebrations, hints at social structures quite different from those that would later develop in Rome. The question of Etruscan women remains one of the most fascinating aspects of their civilization. The archaeological and epigraphic evidence indicates that women enjoyed a status and freedom that would have been unusual in the ancient Mediterranean world. They appear in tomb inscriptions with their own names, suggesting literacy and individual identity. They are depicted in art, participating in public and religious ceremonies, attending banquets, and engaging in cultural activities. Property ownership and economic participation appear to have been accessible to women in ways that would become restricted under Roman law. While the precise extent of their political authority remains a subject of scholarly debate, the material evidence clearly demonstrates that Etruscan women occupied a social position of considerable privilege and influence. The Etruscan language itself remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Using an alphabet derived from Greek sources, the Etruscans created written records that scholars continue to study with intense fascination. Yet, despite centuries of study, the language remains largely undeciphered. Most scholars consider Etruscan a language isolate, unrelated to the Indo-European or Semitic language families that dominated the surrounding regions. A minority of researchers propose connections to the Raetic and Lemnian languages, but such evidence remains scant and hotly debated. The corpus of surviving Etruscan texts consists primarily of short inscriptions on tombs, mirrors, and religious objects, insufficient to unlock the deeper meanings of their language. This linguistic barrier adds to the sense of mystery surrounding Etruscan civilization, even as the material evidence of their achievements grows ever clearer. By the beginning of the 6th century before the Common Era, Etruscan power reached its zenith. The Tarquinian dynasty, an Etruscan royal house, established itself in Rome itself, introducing cultural and architectural innovations that would transform the small settlement on the Tiber into a city of genuine importance. For over a century, from approximately 616 to 509 before the Common Era, Etruscan kings ruled Rome, shaping its institutions, its religious practices, and its urban development. This period of Etruscan dominance in Rome represents the apex of their influence over the Italian peninsula. Yet this very success would plant the seeds of their eventual decline, as the city they had helped to build would eventually turn against them. The 7th century before the Common Era dawned across the Italian peninsula with a paradox that would define Etruscan destiny, even as their cities reached their zenith of power and influence. The seeds of their decline had already been sown in soil they themselves had cultivated. The Etruscan League, that loose confederation of 12 major city-states that had emerged during the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, stood at the precipice of a transformation it could neither fully comprehend nor ultimately control. From the northern reaches of the Po Valley to the southern boundaries of Campania, Etruscan civilization had flourished as a unified cultural force without ever achieving true political unity. This fundamental tension, prosperity without consolidation, sophistication without centralization, would prove to be the civilization's greatest vulnerability. The 12 cities that comprised the Etruscan League, each governed independently, each maintaining its own traditions and rivalries, had created a network of extraordinary achievement. Yet they had also created a system incapable of responding with unified strength to the gathering forces that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The expansion that had characterized Etruscan society during the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era had brought wealth beyond measure. Trade routes connected Etruscan merchants to the Phoenicians of the eastern Mediterranean, to Greek colonists establishing themselves in southern Italy, and to the vast markets of Egypt and the Near East. Gold and silver flowed into Etruscan treasuries, imported luxury goods, Greek pottery with its distinctive black figure designs, Egyptian scarabs, Phoenician glass, filled the tombs and homes of the Etruscan elite. Yet this very prosperity bred complacency. The merchant princes of Etruscan cities grew accustomed to their dominance, assuming that the natural order of Mediterranean commerce would forever favor their interests. It was during this period of expansion that the Etruscan League made a decision that would prove momentous. Around the year 616 before the Common Era, Etruscan kings, specifically those of the Tarquinian dynasty, established their rule over the city that would eventually eclipse all others, Rome. This was not conquest in the brutal sense that later Roman generals would practice. Rather, it was an extension of Etruscan cultural and political authority into a settlement that, though strategically positioned on the Tiber River, remained relatively modest in its scope and influence. The Etruscan kings brought with them their architectural innovations, their religious practices, their governmental structures, and their cultural refinements. The evidence for this period of Etruscan dominion over Rome is both archaeological and literary. Roman historians, writing centuries later, recorded the reign of the Tarquinian kings with a mixture of resentment and acknowledgement. They noted the innovations these rulers introduced, the drainage systems that would transform Rome's marshy valleys into habitable urban spaces, the temple structures that would define Roman sacred architecture for centuries to come, the administrative systems that would become the foundation for Roman governance. The very word that Romans used for king, rex, appears to derive from Etruscan roots, a linguistic echo of the Etruscan presence that shaped early Rome. What the Etruscan rulers of Rome could not have anticipated was that they were nurturing a rival that would eventually consume them. Rome, under Etruscan guidance and influence, began to develop the institutional structures, the military organization, and the civic consciousness that would transform it from a minor settlement into a Mediterranean superpower. The Etruscans taught Rome how to build cities, but Rome would eventually use those lessons to build an empire that would erase Etruscan independence. The crisis began to crystallize during the 5th century before the Common Era. The political situation in Rome had grown increasingly volatile under Etruscan rule. Roman aristocrats, influenced by Greek ideas of republicanism spreading throughout the Mediterranean world, grew resentful of monarchical authority. In 509 before the Common Era, the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, remembered in Roman tradition as a tyrant, was overthrown. The Roman Republic was established, and with it, a new political order that rejected Etruscan kingship and claimed to embody the will of the Roman people. This was more than a change of government. It represented a fundamental rupture in the relationship between Rome and Etruria. Where there had been cultural continuity and political alliance, there now emerged rivalry and then open hostility. The new Roman Republic, governed by consuls and a senate of aristocrats, began to pursue an aggressive expansionist policy that brought it into direct competition with Etruscan city-states for control of central Italy. The turning point came in the 4th century before the Common Era, specifically in the year 396 before the Common Era, when Rome launched a sustained military campaign against Veii. one of the greatest and most ancient Etruscan cities. Veii, situated only about 12 miles north of Rome, had been a major Etruscan center for centuries. The city occupied a strategic position on the Tiber River and controlled valuable trade routes and agricultural lands. For Rome, Veii represented both an obstacle to expansion and a prize of immense value. For the Etruscans, the siege of Veii represented a crisis of existential proportions. Archaeological excavations, particularly those conducted by the British School at Rome during the 20th century and ongoing work by the Soprintendenza Archeologica di Roma, have revealed the sophistication that Veii had achieved before its fall. The remains of the Portonaccio temple, with its terracotta statuary, including the magnificent Apollo of Veii dating to the 6th century before the Common Era, testified to the artistic and architectural achievements of this city. Yet all the beauty and accomplishment that Veii had accumulated over centuries could not protect it from Roman military determination. The siege of Veii was not a brief affair. Roman forces surrounded the city and gradually strangled its ability to receive supplies or reinforcements. The Etruscan cities of the League, despite their cultural unity, could not mount an effective coordinated response. The fundamental weakness of the Etruscan political system, the absence of a centralized authority capable of commanding unified military action, became catastrophically apparent. Each city-state pursued its own interests, negotiated its own treaties, and made its own calculations about whether to commit its forces to the defense of Veii. By the time the Roman army finally breached the city's walls, Veii stood essentially alone. The fall of Veii reverberated through Etruscan civilization like a thunderclap across a summer sky. The city was not merely conquered, it was systematically destroyed. The population was either killed, enslaved, or dispersed. The temples were desecrated, the tombs were violated. Roman soldiers carried away the sacred objects and the wealth that had accumulated within Veii's walls. For the Etruscan world, the destruction of Veii was a profound shock, a demonstration that their cities, for all their sophistication and cultural achievement, could not withstand the organized military power that Rome was methodically building. Yet the crisis that Veii's fall represented extended far beyond military considerations. It was a cultural and psychological crisis as well. The Etruscan way of life had been predicated on the assumption that their cities would endure, that their traditions would persist, that their influence would continue to shape the Mediterranean world. The destruction of Veii shattered these assumptions. It revealed that the Etruscan city-states, for all their individual magnificence, were vulnerable to a power that was emerging with systematic, relentless determination to dominate central Italy. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the final subjugation of Etruria by Rome proceeded with grim inevitability. One by one, the remaining Etruscan cities either submitted to Roman authority or were conquered by Roman military force. The league that had once united 12 major city-states in a loose confederation of shared culture and mutual interest ceased to function as a political entity. Etruscan kings and aristocrats found themselves incorporated into the Roman social hierarchy, often as subordinate partners in a system increasingly dominated by Roman patrician families. The crisis that had begun with the overthrow of the Tarquinian dynasty in Rome and accelerated with the siege of Veii was completed with the subjugation of Etruria. Yet this completion was not an ending but a transformation. The Etruscans as a political force had been defeated. Their independent city-states had been absorbed into the expanding Roman Republic. Their kings and their league had been rendered irrelevant. But Etruscan culture, Etruscan knowledge, and Etruscan influence would not disappear. Instead, they would be absorbed, transformed, and woven into the fabric of Roman civilization itself. The crisis was also one of identity and continuity. As Roman power expanded and Etruscan political independence contracted, the question of what it meant to be Etruscan became increasingly fraught. Would Etruscan culture survive in the shadow of Roman domination? Would the Etruscan language persist as Roman Latin spread? Would Etruscan religious practices continue as Roman religious authority established itself? These questions, implicit in the military defeats and political subjugations of the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, would shape the subsequent fate of Etruscan civilization. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the complexity of the transition. Tombs from the 3rd century before the Common Era show a gradual shift in burial practices, in artistic styles, and in the objects deemed worthy of accompanying the dead into the afterlife. Greek and Roman influences become increasingly prominent, while distinctly Etruscan elements remain but become intermingled with external styles. This archaeological record suggests not a sudden extinction, but a gradual transformation, a process by which Etruscan elites negotiated their place within an expanding Roman world. The turning point and the crisis that defined the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Italian peninsula. The Etruscan civilization, which had flourished as the dominant cultural and political force in central Italy for centuries, found itself confronted by a rival that was younger, more unified, and possessed of a ruthless determination to expand and dominate. The sophisticated city-states that had created remarkable art, engineered impressive infrastructure, and built complex societies could not withstand the organized military and political power that Rome was methodically constructing. Yet even in defeat, the Etruscan civilization would leave an indelible mark on the civilization that conquered it. The very Romans who destroyed Etruscan political independence would inherit and perpetuate Etruscan cultural achievements. The temples they built would incorporate Etruscan architectural principles, the gods they worshipped would retain Etruscan characteristics, the governmental structures they developed would reflect Etruscan precedents. The crisis that brought Etruscan political independence to an end was simultaneously the beginning of a process by which Etruscan culture would be absorbed, transformed, and transmitted into the classical world that would define Western civilization for millennia to come. The twilight of Etruscan independence arrived not with a single catastrophic blow, but through the patient, methodical expansion of a neighboring power that would eventually consume everything the Etruscans had built. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the Roman state, itself transformed by centuries of Etruscan cultural influence, had begun its relentless march toward dominance over the Italian peninsula. The sophisticated civilization that had once commanded the central Mediterranean, that had established the Etruscan League as a confederation of 12 major city-states bound by shared religious observance and commercial interest, now faced an adversary that had learned all too well from Etruscan example. The pivotal moment came in the year 396, before the Common Era, when Roman legions conquered Veii, one of the largest and most prosperous Etruscan cities. Veii, located at coordinates 42 degrees 0 minutes 16 seconds north and 12 degrees 23 minutes 27 seconds east, had flourished for centuries as a center of Etruscan power and artistic achievement. The city commanded the Tiber River Valley, controlling vital trade routes and agricultural lands that made it indispensable to Etruscan economic life. The fall of Veii reverberated across Etruria like a funeral bell, signaling that the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. Roman armies, commanded by the legendary general Camillus, besieged the city with a determination and tactical sophistication that the Etruscans could no longer match. When Veii finally fell, its conquest marked not merely the loss of a single city, but the beginning of the end for Etruscan independence. What followed across the subsequent centuries was a gradual but inexorable process of absorption and assimilation. The 3rd century before the Common Era witnessed the final subjugation of Etruria by Rome, as city after city either submitted to Roman authority or faced conquest. Yet this subjugation was not accompanied by the cultural erasure that might have been expected. Instead, something far more subtle and ultimately more profound occurred. The Etruscans did not disappear, but rather dissolved into the fabric of Roman civilization, their distinctive identity preserved not in political independence, but in the cultural DNA of their conqueror. The relationship between Rome and Etruria during these centuries of transition reveals itself most clearly through the lens of archaeological evidence and the fragmentary historical records that have survived the millennia. Roman historians, writing centuries after the events they described, preserved accounts of Etruscan kings ruling Rome during the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, specifically the Tarquinian dynasty, which introduced crucial innovations in architecture, urban planning, and religious practice. The Etruscan kings built the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, established the Roman Forum as a civic center, and introduced the fasces, bundles of rods bound around an axe, as symbols of Roman authority. These were not merely architectural or administrative changes, they represented the wholesale transplantation of Etruscan cultural and political frameworks into the emerging Roman state. As Roman power expanded and Etruscan political independence contracted, the process of cultural integration accelerated. By the 1st century before the Common Era, full Roman citizenship had been granted to the Etruscans, formally recognizing their incorporation into the Roman political system. This was not a conquest followed by suppression, but rather an integration that acknowledged the value of Etruscan civilization and its contributions to the emerging superpower. The Etruscans retained their local traditions, their religious practices, and their artistic sensibilities, even as they became Romans in political status and allegiance. The archaeological record provides eloquent testimony to this process of cultural transmission and transformation. The magnificent tombs of Cerveteri, located at coordinates 42 degrees 0 minutes 24 seconds north and 12 degrees 6 minutes 7 seconds east, continue to yield treasures that illuminate the sophistication of Etruscan life and the ways in which this civilization influenced the world that succeeded it. And the Regolini Galassi tomb, discovered in 1836, contained extraordinary gold jewelry, intricately worked bronze vessels, and imported Greek pottery dating to the 7th century before the Common Era. These artifacts speak to the wealth, refined taste, and far-reaching trade networks of Etruscan elites. More significantly, they reveal a civilization comfortable with luxury, beauty, and the aesthetic refinement that would become hallmarks of Roman culture at its height. The Banditaccia necropolis at Cerveteri, extensively excavated by Raniero Mengarelli in the early 20th century and subsequently by the University of Rome La Sapienza, presents a vast city of the dead where hundreds of tombs preserve the memory of Etruscan families and their possessions. Walking through these burial grounds, one encounters not monuments to forgotten darkness, but celebrations of a life well lived. The tombs themselves were constructed to resemble the houses of the living, complete with multiple rooms, furnishings rendered in stone, and elaborate decorative schemes. This architectural philosophy, that the tomb should echo the home, speaks to an Etruscan worldview that saw continuity between the living and the dead, between this world and the end. Similarly, the excavations at Vulci, located at coordinates 42 degrees 25 minutes 10 seconds north, and 11 degrees 37 minutes 49 seconds east, have revealed the extent of Etruscan artistic achievement and cultural refinement. The François tomb, one of the most significant discoveries at Vulci, contains elaborate wall paintings depicting scenes of warfare, athletics, and ceremony. These images, created by anonymous artists working in the 5th century before the Common Era, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of perspective, movement, and human anatomy. The paintings at the Tomb of the Leopards in Tarquinia, executed in the same period, present scenes of banqueting and dancing that convey the joy and vitality that characterized Etruscan social life. Women appear prominently in these paintings, reclining alongside men at banquets, participating in athletic competitions, and engaging in the public life of their communities, a visibility that starkly contrasts with the more restricted roles that women would occupy in classical Roman society. The question of Etruscan women and their social status represents one of the most fascinating and contested areas of Etruscan studies. Greek and Roman writers expressed shock at the freedom and prominence of Etruscan women who attended public gatherings, participated in athletic competitions, owned property, and exercised influence in family and civic affairs. Archaeological evidence, including tomb inscriptions and artistic representations, confirms that Etruscan women enjoyed considerably greater social equality than their Greek or Roman counterparts. The extent of their political power remains unclear and continues to generate scholarly debate, but the evidence for their high social status and literacy is compelling. In a civilization where women could own property, be named in formal inscriptions, and be depicted prominently in scenes of civic and religious importance, we see a society fundamentally different from the patriarchal structures that would dominate the Mediterranean world in subsequent centuries. The question of Etruscan language and its ultimate fate represents another crucial dimension of the civilization's legacy and decline. Etruscan was a language isolate, unrelated to the Indo-European family that encompasses most European languages, nor was it connected to Semitic linguistic families. This linguistic uniqueness has proven to be both a treasure and a curse for scholars seeking to understand Etruscan civilization. The corpus of Etruscan inscriptions is relatively limited, consisting primarily of short funerary texts, religious dedications, and commercial notations. A minority of scholars have proposed that Etruscan belongs to a Tyrcenian language family, potentially related to Rhaetic and Lemnian, but this hypothesis remains controversial and unsupported by substantial evidence. Despite centuries of scholarly effort, no breakthrough in decipherment has occurred, and the full complexity of the Etruscan language remains largely inaccessible to modern investigators. As Etruscan political independence waned and Roman authority expanded, the Etruscan language gradually ceased to be spoken in favor of Latin. This linguistic transition was not imposed through violent suppression, but occurred gradually through the natural processes of cultural assimilation and the practical advantages of adopting the language of the dominant power. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Etruscan had become a dead language, preserved only in ancient inscriptions and the fragmentary texts that classical authors had recorded. Yet even as the language disappeared, the cultural elements it had expressed lived on, embedded in Roman religious practice, architectural tradition, urban planning, and social custom. The religious legacy of Etruria proved particularly enduring within Roman civilization. The Etruscans possessed a highly developed system of divination based on the interpretation of bird flight, the examination of animal entrails, and the observation of lightning and other celestial phenomena. Roman priests, known as haruspices, continued to practice these forms of divination for centuries after Etruscan political independence had vanished. The Roman state maintained official positions for haruspices well into the imperial period, demonstrating the persistence of Etruscan religious practices within the Roman religious establishment. Similarly, Etruscan religious architecture, with its emphasis on temples as centers of civic and religious life, profoundly influenced Roman temple design and the role of religious institutions in Roman urban planning. Recent archaeological investigation has continued to illuminate the sophistication of Etruscan civilization and the mechanisms through which it influenced the societies that followed. DNA analysis conducted in 2021 confirmed that the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, descending from the Villanovan culture that had flourished in central Italy during the Iron Age. This genetic evidence resolved a long-standing scholarly debate about Etruscan origins, definitively establishing that they were not migrants from the eastern Mediterranean or Anatolia, but rather the direct descendants of earlier Italian populations who had undergone cultural transformation through contact with Mediterranean trading networks and external influences. The Etruscans represented not an invasion from without, but an indigenous evolution, a flowering of Italian culture that emerged from deep historical roots. Ongoing excavations at Vulci and Tarquinia continue to reveal new tombs and artifacts that expand our understanding of Etruscan civilization. These investigations, employing digital documentation and conservation techniques developed in recent decades, have permitted scholars to study Etruscan material culture with unprecedented precision. The work of the Fondazione Vulci and the Soprintendenza Archeologica di Roma has opened new perspectives on Etruscan daily life, artistic production, and the mechanisms of cultural change that attended the Roman conquest. Each new discovery adds texture and complexity to our understanding of a civilization that has, for too long, been relegated to the footnotes of Mediterranean history. The Villa Giulia Museum in Rome, the British Museum in London, and the specialized collections housed in Italian archaeological institutions preserve the material remains through which we know the Etruscan world. The artifacts themselves, the terracotta sculptures from the Portonaccio temple at Veii, including the remarkable Apollo of Veii, the intricate goldwork from the Regolini Galassi tomb, the vibrant wall paintings from Tarquinia and elsewhere, constitute a testament to a civilization of extraordinary aesthetic achievement and cultural sophistication. These objects, created by anonymous artisans working in the centuries before Rome's rise to dominance, speak across the millennia to convey the vision and values of a people whose direct political existence has long since ended, but whose cultural legacy continues to shape the world we inhabit. To understand the Etruscan legacy is to recognize that history rarely proceeds through simple narratives of conquest and replacement. The Etruscans did not vanish when Rome rose to power, rather they transformed, their distinctive identity absorbed into a larger civilization that incorporated their achievements while transcending them. The Romans who conquered Etruria were themselves already transformed by Etruscan influence, having been shaped by centuries of cultural contact and interaction. What emerged was a synthesis, a new civilization that drew upon Etruscan foundations while extending far beyond them in scope and ambition. The sophisticated urban planning that characterized Etruscan cities, with their careful organization of public and private spaces, their attention to drainage and water management, and their integration of religious and civic functions, provided models that Roman architects would refine and perfect. The artistic traditions that flourished in Etruscan workshops, the terracotta sculpture, the bronze working, the painting techniques, were absorbed into Roman artistic practice and transmitted to the broader Mediterranean world. The political and religious institutions that the Etruscans had developed, including the federal structure of the Etruscan League and the sophisticated religious practices through which they sought to divine the will of the gods, influenced the institutional frameworks through which Rome organized itself and its territories. The story of the Etruscans, therefore, is not a tragedy of decline and disappearance, but rather a narrative of transformation and enduring influence. A civilization that had flourished as a major Mediterranean power, that had established great cities and refined arts, that had developed sophisticated systems of governance and religious practice, did not vanish when Roman legions conquered its territory. Instead, it merged with its conqueror, its achievements preserved and transmitted through the vehicle of Roman civilization to all the peoples and cultures that Rome would subsequently touch and transform. Today, more than 2,000 years after the last Etruscan inscriptions were carved into stone, the legacy of this remarkable civilization continues to speak to us through the archaeological remains it left behind, the tombs of Cerveteri and Tarquinia, the temples of Veii, the artifacts preserved in museums across Europe and the Mediterranean. These constitute an enduring dialogue between past and present. They remind us that civilizations do not exist in isolation, that cultural achievements transcend political boundaries, and that the great powers that shape history are themselves shaped by those who came before. The Etruscans, having passed from political independence into cultural absorption, achieved a form of immortality through their influence on one of history's greatest civilizations. In this way, the story of Rome cannot be told without acknowledging the Etruscan foundations upon which it was built, the sophisticated predecessors whose vision and achievement provided the cultural infrastructure through which Rome itself would rise to reshape the Mediterranean world and echo through the corridors of history for millennia to come.